of the things that you might want to watch out for at UK and Changing Europe is we've been commissioned by the House of Lords European Affairs Committee to produce a regular divergence tracker for them. And we published our first edition of that back in September or early October, and we're updating it now. They get first sight of it, and then we make it available for public consumption. We thought the focus was on regulatory divergence. They seem to want to go a bit wider onto policy divergence more generally than you might think about regulation. So what I thought I would do is, I know some of you already, I would just do a sort of rapido tour d'horizon of where we are. And many apologies, I'm going to try and get through this like super quickly so we can then have a bit of a chat. But I do have to go because I am due at a funeral, unfortunately, of somebody I used to play tennis with. And so I do need to change it out of stripy top and get myself over there. So super rapidly, where are we now? So it's basically, 2 years since that general election, which you could argue shaped the force of Brexit. Remember, the government's big mantra was that they had to go for a very different sort of deal to the one Theresa May might have ended up with, because their absolute priority was regulatory autonomy. And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but you might want to re-sheep dip yourself in the government narrative. Yesterday, David Frost gave a speech to the Centre for Policy Studies where he reiterated his view that unless we diverged from the EU, Brexit was pointless, and actually all we would have done was inflict on ourselves the wound of doing things the same as the EU, but in a much smaller market. So David Frost is now, I think you could regard himself within government, the sort of almost self-anointed owner of the arc of a proper Brexit, and sees his role as that. And indeed, his ministerial role covers two things. It covers the managing the agreements with the EU on the trade and cooperation agreement and the withdrawal agreement. But the second part of his role covers what's called Brexit opportunities. And there was an exercise in the summer to recruit a new director for the Brexit opportunities unit. And I think they have now made an appointment, but it seems to be within the civil service, which wasn't their intention. But watch that space. So David Frost is arguing we really urgently need to get on with this deregulatory agenda. But actually, if you sort of tick off the sort of areas that the government wanted to do on Brexit, the sort of those vote leave promises, many of them they could point to being delivered. I mean, they've taken back control on fish, subject to, or at least they can claim that they will have done at the end of the transition. Though obviously the EU can then cut us out of their market. So we may end up with something like the status quo even 5 and a bit years hence. We've ended free movement of labour, haven't quite controlled our borders. And we see from all those little boats arriving, though actually asylum applications overall are down. And we rejected the notion with the EU of having a quite extensive mobility agreement. That's encountered some of those problems we've seen for people wanting to do business in EU countries, touring musicians and whatever. We're only going to pay for the programmes we're participating in, but we've actually seen a hold up there on the EU side because they say the UK is being so difficult over ratifying UK participation in the big EU research programme Horizon Europe. But the big thing is taking back control of laws, and that's where it sort of matters to you and where I think we are still in the foothills of where this will be going. So what have we seen? We've seen the new migration regime that's now up and operating, and really interestingly, it's actually liberalised migration from outside the EU at the same time as subjecting migrants from within the EU/EEA to the same regime as elsewhere. And we've also just recently seen a bit of a hardening of those border controls with the insistence that you need to be able to produce an individual passport to come to the UK, that you can no longer travel on a group passport or with ID cards. See some of that fallout for the sort of foreign language sector and school exchange, things like that. We've only just passed the Environment Bill, actually first introduced under Theresa May, knocking around for ages, envisaged by Michael Gove, with the new environmental oversight regime. That finally means that the Office for Environmental Protection is no longer an interim shadow body. But there's still more to be done, because remember, the Environment Act just takes the powers to set those long-run environmental targets. They have yet to be set. And we haven't yet seen how those powers that the OEP has, those enforcement powers, supposed to be a substitute for the European enforcement regime, are actually going to work. Another big area, agriculture. DEFRA, we're doing some work on this at the Institute for Government at the moment. DEFRA is talking a long game on the new agricultural regimes, but they're still not implemented, due to start kicking in from 2024. If the government holds its nerve, they can be massively radical, but I think there's already been a bit of reshading back from the pure Govian vision with George Eustice. We're seeing the stirrings of the UK's new future trade policy. Quite interesting. We've got those new agreements in principle, Australia and New Zealand, long-term ambitions around joining CPTPP. So we've got some sort of bits there so far, but not much else. Where else have we got? A bit of things. We've got free ports, which I think most economists think, if they do anything, really just relocate economic activity rather than do anything to boost growth overall. The Chancellor's a big champion of those, of course. We've had some very minor tax tweaks in the budget. In some ways, the budget was more noticeable for what the Chancellor didn't do. And I think this is quite interesting. Seemed to resist changes on VAT, which he'd now be open to do, and didn't get rid of the bankers' bonus cap, which you might have thought he might do, because he thought that would go down relatively badly. And I think that fits in to where is the support for regulatory changes. We have seen some sort of little bits of outings. The government's, some of the government's most interesting acts have been on animal welfare, with their live animal export ban. Lots of squeaks from farmers about that. But remember, the Conservative manifesto said one reason we want to be liberated from the EU was to raise standards, not to reduce them. But also some consultation on gene editing, possibly leading on to things on genetic modification. But actually, much the biggest thing is on the regulatory front is not what we're actively doing, but what we call in our regulatory divergence tracker, passive or procedural, passive divergence, where the EU moves, but we don't follow. And what we call procedural divergence, where we actually have to set up different systems because we're outside the EU regulatory system, even though we might be implementing, remember, most of this is still in retained EU law, even where we might be implementing the same regimes. And actually, there's a really, really interesting question there. And we've seen this as an outing on both the European, the new Chemicals Agency, HSE, doing chemicals regulation, and also in the Medicines Regulatory Agency. The Medicines Regulatory Agency used to do loads of subcontracted work for the European Medicines Agency. They don't do that anymore. So they've suffered a big income fall. The government doesn't appear to be making up that deficit. And one of the effects there is that actually the UK regulators have less regulatory capacity. So I think that's sort of an interesting one to watch, that even where the intent is the same, is the ability the same. Remember too, that even if the UK wants to follow EU law, and a lot of businesses will want them to stay in line with EU law for various reasons, the government doesn't have the easy device it used to have of just shoving through a bunch of secondary legislation through the European Communities Act. So it would actually have to sort of legislate properly. And it's always a bit of a bum fight within government to get time and space for legislation. So we will, over time, I think, probably see more of that divergence coming out of passive divergence and regulatory capacity and regulatory approaches in the UK regulators. Obviously, further complications of when am I talking about GB, when am I talking about Northern Ireland, but I'm going to leave you to work that out, because otherwise all this would have to go on about 15 times as long as I'm going to talk about. But we did see, we've seen some moves. I mean, you know, we had a big debate last year on financial services. Was the EU going to get this famous equivalence decision? The EU held off. despite the fact that the UK was clearly equivalent or whatever, the EU preferred instead to grab a big chunk of UK financial services if it could by denying the UK financial services firms easier access to EU markets. UK has less in place than Singapore or the US in terms of access. So the Chancellor's now, I think, given up the ghost on that and now decided he actually has to take different measures to try and build the UK as a competing centre, trying to do a deal with Switzerland on easier access between the UK and Switzerland, but he's trying to build up the UK's advantage, whether it's on fintech, whether it's on green finance, where we're doing things differently from the EU. Interesting to see how that goes. The sort of biggish action on regulation was subcontracted to the unlikely trio of Ian Duncan Smith, Theresa Villiers and George Freeman in the summer. They produced their famous Tigger report. And that really said, actually, don't look so much at the backstock of regulation, look much more at forward-looking regulation, new regulation, look at areas where the UK might gain a sort of edge by leading. It was quite pro these things called sandboxes, where you actually focus on the outcome rather than the processes and things like that. And that may have charted a way forward. But at the same time, a few weeks later, David Frost made a speech saying, well, we do need to look at all that backlog of retained EU law, that stuff we transferred over under Theresa May and Boris Johnson through the original EU Withdrawal Act. And we're going to have a streamlined mechanism for doing that. Now, my legal colleagues are all putting up sort of big things and flashing red lights on their heads about what this streamlined mechanism is going to look like, because streamlined mechanism to David Frost means cutting out parliamentary scrutiny to a whole bunch of other people. And so it's really one to watch as to what is proposed there, how expansive is the scope, and how might the government use that, because that would be the government's method for getting in there. And a bit sub rosa, government's not finding it terribly easy to get stuff through its backbenches at the moment, I think is one of the lessons in the last few weeks, might equip itself with the wherewithal to chip away at the back of the at that big sort of block of retained EU laws. So I think I would be definitely on the watch out for what might the great Lord Frost have in mind there. I think it's really interesting. David Frost yesterday, I mean, I was going to say, one of the things we have to reckon on divergence, a lot of these are in areas which are devolved or which subject to the Northern Ireland Protocol. So where we do diverge, for whatever reason, you risk deepening the border in the Irish Sea, causing more complexities at that GB Northern Ireland border. You also risk rows with the devolves. The Scots and Welsh have said broadly they want to stay in line with EU rules. The Scots obviously because they want to open the way, pave the way to simple rejoining the EU, and the less they diverge from the emerging EU acquis, the easier that will be. Past this continuity bill to give themselves the powers to do that, but also through the UK Internal Market Act, which they hate. And if you want to see how much they hate them, can I recommend my colleague Akash Pound's conversation with John Swinney last week, who has sort of had steam coming out of ears, top of his head or whatever, every time he mentioned the Internal Market Act, even though it was passed well over a year ago, which is regarded as riding absolute roughshod over devolved powers. And they note that there are far fewer carve-outs there than there were even in the EU single market for what you can do in the domestic framework. So any divergence in England potentially raises those sets of problems. But I think it's really interesting that David Frost yesterday went back to the vision of the sort of low taxi economy. There's been lots of debates in the EU. Remember, Philip Hammond was the person who way back when he was trying to frighten the EU into giving the UK a decent trade deal, said, if you don't give us a decent trade deal, cut us into decent access to your market, we'll have no option but to be Singapore on Thames. Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, finally mentioned Brexit in his Conservative Party conference speech. And it's clear that actually his vision for the UK economy looks quite a lot more like sort of Silicon Valley than Singapore, but he's really interested in this sort of, Californian style entrepreneurism. And colleagues of mine who work in the Treasury, friends of mine who work in the Treasury, tell me that you can't stop Rishi Sunak from going on about California as a formative experience, and not just because he met his wife at Stanford. Anyway, so some constraints though on what the UK could do. Remember that there are lots of quite interesting mechanisms in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and in particular the rebalancing mechanism. The UK makes a sort of full frontal assault on all those provisions that were so tortuously agreed right until the last minute on level playing fields. That's labour and environmental standards predominantly. So you can't take the TCA for granted in the sense that you might a more normal distant trade agreement. The EU insisted on all that because they are genuinely worried about undercutting. But actually the other bit of TCA impermanence is the ongoing rows. We've seen quite substantive rows about Northern Ireland, quite second order rows about fishing licenses. So we've seen that. But we're also seeing, I think, and I thought it was quite interesting, Keir Starmer finally at the CBI yesterday, starting to get a bit of a voice, having lost his voice for really quite a long time after the election, his election as Labour leader on Brexit, by saying that Labour was now focusing on making Brexit work. And Labour is now clearly developing an agenda which is about more alignment, more deals with the EU, and not erecting the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, I think, to anything like the totemic principle that it is if you are a convinced Brexit sovereigntist. So I think there's an emerging political debate about Brexit that we haven't seen really with Labour sort of looking anywhere but at Brexit over the last year and a half. So I think we're starting to see some sort of emerging battle lines, both within government, and I do think your red wall thing is very interesting. I'd be very interested to know what your focus, I won't be there, what your focus groups were saying, because I listened in to a UK and a Changing Europe focus group, and it was quite interesting that some of the people there with people who defected to the Conservatives the first time in 2019, and what was really interesting, and God knows why, didn't really get that out of them, but those that were dissatisfied with the Conservatives, most were still sticking with them, not defecting back to Labour, they were saying they were going to vote Green next time round. Is that a new conviction? I know my colleague Paula Surridge thinks that in polls people say they vote Green, but a lot of them ultimately go back at the time of election when they're faced with that binary choice back to Labour. So I think it's really interesting. Is there any greening of British politics going on in a substantive way, and can it actually survive first past the post, but will that show up in different attitudes? I think what the government is realising, and governments always do realise, is that the game on deregulation is much easier to talk in theory than it is in practice, because the trouble is when you talk about deregulation, I'm going to stop here, you focus entirely on the costs of regulation, but actually you have to remember that most regulations actually do ultimately have some point, and they do have some benefits. And when you actually call into question those regulations, people suddenly start thinking, actually, we quite like quite a lot of those protections there were. So very early outing this year from the government when it was looking at worker protections a bit. And I think Kwasi Kwarteng had to have a volte face within about 2-3 days, whatever review might have been going on or might have been a gleam in his eye was very, very summarily terminated. Anyway, so I'm going to leave it there as a big thing. So I think it's still to play for. There are the hawks within government, Frost, maybe Sunak, and others. I think there are others who want to get on with things like levelling up, the Goves, who've always been much more reticent, I think, on some of this agenda.